Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 Administering User Security. In this chapter, we are going to create and manage database user accounts, grant and revoke privileges, create and manage roles, create and manage profiles. In order to access a database account must be created. Each database account has a unique username. Username cannot exceed 30 bytes, cannot contain special characters, and must start with a letter. An authentication method. There are three types of authentication methods. The first one, which is password, the common way to authenticate a user. The second one, which is global authentication. Global authentication means authenticate the database user using Oracle OID. The database password is stored in OID, not internally in the database. This is means by global authentication. The last authentication method, which is external authentication, means authenticate the user using external authentication such as biometric, certificate, or token authentication. A default table space. This is the place where a user create objects, tables, and indexes. During creating a table or index, if the user didn't specify the table space that will hold the table or index segment, the default table space will be used to hold the segment of the table or index. This is meant by a default table space. Having a default table space does not imply that the user has the privilege to create indexes or create tables. You have to grant the needed privileges to create tables or indexes. But the default table space means this is the default place to hold the segment of the table or index. If the user didn't specify a table space during creating the index or during creating a table. A temporary table space. Each database user account has a temporary table space that will be used for sorting, for joining, for creating temporary tables. A user profile. This is a set of resource and password restrictions assigned to a user. We will discuss about user profile later on in this chapter. An initial consumer group. Consumer groups are used by resource manager. An account status. Account status can be open, locked, or locked and expired. Open means you can log into the database by using that user account. If the account is locked, you cannot access the database by using that user account. The account must be open in order to access the database. The expired means the password must be changed before logging to the database. This is meant by expired. What is a schema? Some of Oracle database administrators or some of Oracle database developers cannot differentiate between a user account and the schema. A schema is a collection of objects that are owned by a database user. A collection of database objects like tables, indexes, functions, procedures, packages owned by a specific user account. This is called a schema. For example, let's assume that there is a user account called HR user. HR user database account has tables, indexes, functions, procedure. This group of objects owned by the HR user called HR schema. Again, the database objects owned by HR user called HR schema. There are some predefined user accounts created by default during creating the database. These predefined accounts are very important to the database to do some important administrative tasks. The first one, which is the sys user, system user, sys backup, sysdg, and syskm. Sys user owns the data dictionary and the automatic workload repository. We will talk about Oracle automatic workload repository later on in this material. The system user owns additional administrative tables and views. Sys backup, this is introduced in 12c, used for Oracle Recovery Manager, backup and recovery operations. Before 12c, if you want to take a backup or to do a recovery of your database, you have to connect as sys user. But starting from 12c, you can connect as sysbackup user, or you can create a user and grant sysbackup privilege to that user, so you can connect to that user and do backup and recovery operation. But before 12c, you have to connect to sys user. sysdg, this is a user used for Oracle Data Guard operations, switchover and failover operations. syskm used for transparent data encryption wallet operation, like creating credential store, creating a master key, creating keys, and other transparent data encryption operations. Administrative privileges. Any database created comes with predefined privileges. These privileges used to facilitate separation of duties. The first one, which is sysdba. Any user that has the sysdba privilege can manage standard database operations like start up, shut down the database instance, create server parameter, put the database in archive log mode, creating table space, creating read log groups, allow to grant to view user data, and so on. This is a very super administrative privilege. So you have to be very careful during assigning sysdba privilege to any user, because assigning sysdba privilege to a user, that's mean allow that user account to connect to the database as sysuser. Connecting as sysuser, he can do anything, including dropping a database. So you have to be very careful to assign sysdba to a database account user. Sysupper administrative privilege, this is used for manage standard database operation like startup, shutdown database instance, creating server parameter file, and changing the archive log mode of the database. Sysbackup, this is administrative privilege introduced in 12c. This is used to manage recovery manager, backup, and recovery operation. Before 12c, in order to do backup and recovery operation, you have to connect as sysuser, a user with sysdba privilege. sysdg manage data guard operation like switchover and failover operation. syskm manage transparent data encryption wallet operation like creating credential stores, creating master keys, and creating encryption keys, and so on. How to create a user? You can use either Oracle Database Express or using SQL Plus to create a database user account, or you can use, if you have Oracle Cloud Control, you can also use Oracle Cloud Control to create an Oracle Database user account. If you are using Oracle Database Express, go to Security, Users, a list of all created users shown in the screen. You can go to Create User. During Create a User, you can specify the account name. Again, account name cannot exceed 30 bytes, cannot have special characters, and must start with character. Authentication, as we discussed before, there are three types of authentication: password, external, or global. Password mode, specify the password for the user. External means using biometric, for example, or token authentication or other external authentications. Global, using, for example, Oracle Internet Directory to authenticate user, storing the password in LDAP directory like Oracle OID. In our case, we are going to use password mode. If you choose password mode, you have to specify a password and confirm the password of that user. The profile of that user account. Later on, we will discuss about the profile and how to create a profile. By default, the default profile will assign to T-John, for example, user account. Account status. In the account status, you can expire the password. Expire the password means if the user trying to connect to the database, Oracle will prompt the user to change the password immediately before logging to the database. Account locked means the database user account is locked and cannot be used to access the database. To access the database, the account must be open. Click Next. It will ask you to specify the default table space for that user and the default temporary table space for the user being created. Default table space is if you don't specify a default table space, user's table space will be assigned to the user being created. So any table or index created by T-John user will automatically go to user's table space if the user didn't provide a table space during creating index or creating a table. Temporary table space, by default, temporary table space will be assigned to the user being created. You can change the temporary table space if you have other temporary table spaces. The last wizard for creating a database user account, which is the privilege. We will discuss about privilege later on in this chapter. So this is how to create a user by using Oracle Database Express. If you want to create a user using SQL Plus, we can use a create user command. Create user, specify the username, identified by, specify the password. We can also specify a default table space for the user, for example, default table space users, and a temporary table space temp and profile, for example, default. If you just finish the statement like this, put semicolon here without providing this information, by default a user's table space will assign to the user as a default table space, and temp will be assigned to the user as a temporary table space, and default profile also will automatically assign to the user being created. Changing account status and resetting password. Again, in order to connect to the database, the account status must be open. If the account status is locked, you cannot log in to the Oracle database by that user. The account status must be open in order to connect to the database. So how to change the account status in case the account status is locked or in case the password is expired? You can change the account status by either using Oracle Database Express or using Oracle SQL Plus, or by using Cloud Control in case you have a Cloud Control. To change the status, you go to Security, Users. In the Actions, you can click the user that you want to change. From the Actions, Alter Account. In the Alter Account, you can change the password of the user if the password is expired, and you can also change the account status. For example, if the account is locked, you can unlock the account. If the account is unlocked, you can lock the account. If you want to use SQL Plus commands to change the account status, for example, alter user tjohn identified by a password. This is how to reset the password in case the password, for example, is expired. If the account is locked, you can use alter user tjohn account unlock to change the lock status from locked to open. Alter user tjohn account unlock. So after creating the database user account, as a DBA, you have to start assigning privileges or permission to that database user account. So the privileges or permission is the right to execute a specific SQL command or the right to access a specific user's object. There are two types of privileges. The first one, which is system privileges, and the second one, which is object privileges. System privileges, which enable Oracle database user account to perform a particular actions in the database. For example, create a table, create an index, drop a table, drop an index, create a trigger, create a procedure, create function. This is called system privilege. The right to perform a particular action in the database. Object privilege is enable users to access and manipulate a specific object. Like, for example, select on a table called depth table in HR schema, or insert in HR.department table, or privilege to delete from HR department table, and so on. So system privilege allows the user to perform a particular action in the database, while object privilege allows the user to perform a specific action on a specific object. For example, department object, employees object, sales history object, and so on. A specific object. By default, if you create a user by using SQL Plus or by using Oracle Database Express, the user does not have any privilege. Even he cannot connect to the database. So as a DBA, after creating an database user account, you have to start assigning a specific system and object privilege to that user so the user can start perform his job. How to grant and system privileges. You can grant system privileges either by using Oracle Database Express or using Oracle SQL Plus, or even if you have an Oracle Cloud Control, you can also use Oracle Cloud Control to assign system privileges. To assign system privileges, go to Security, Users, select the user that you want to assign system privileges to. Then from the actions, go to Alter Privileges and Roles. Once you click Alter Privilege and Role, this wizard will be displayed. You can select the system privilege or role that you want to grant to this user, and from the arrow sign you can move it to the second box. So this user now has a create table, create sequence, and create a procedure. Once finished, click OK. Here we can see there is a checkbox called with admin option. What's mean by with admin option here? If you grant create table, create sequence, create a procedure, for example, with admin option, if you click on this button, that's mean assigning a create table, create sequence, create a procedure to the tjohn user, and tjohn user can assign the same privileges to other database users. This is mean by with admin option. With admin option means granting the privileges to tjohn user allow tjohn user also to grant the same privileges to other database users. This is mean by with admin option. If you revoke these privileges from tjohn user, there is no cascading revoke. For example, let's assume there are two users, user 1 and user 2. You as a DBA connect to the database and grant create table to user 1 with admin option. That means user 1 now has a create table system privilege, and he can also grant create table to other users. So he can connect to the database and grant create table to, for example, user 2. Both users can create table now. If you as a DBA revoke create table from user 1, user 2 will still has a create table privilege. There is no cascading revoke. How to use Oracle SQL Plus to grant a system privilege? Grant create table, create view, create procedure to tjohn user. Now tjohn user can create a table or can create a view or can create a procedure on the database. Object privileges, also you can use either Oracle Database Express or Oracle SQL Plus to grant specific object privileges to a specific database user. Again, go to Security, Users, select the user that you want to grant an object privilege to. Go to Actions, Grant Object Privilege. In the Grant Object Privileges, you can first select the schema that owns the object, click Next, then select the object that you want to grant object privileges to, and then you can grant the object privileges. For example, select update, read, reference, query, rewrite, insert, update, delete, and so on. So the difference between object privilege and system privilege: object privilege granting a specific privileges like insert, update, delete, reference, read, query, rewrite on a specific object, like for example department table. In object privilege there is also something called with grant options. In system privilege there is something called with admin option, and we see what's mean by with admin option. Here in object privilege there is something called with grant option. What's mean by with grant option? It's like with admin option in system privilege. With the grant option, if you for example grant update insert on a department table to tjohn user, that means tjohn user now has an update insert on a department table, and he also can grant update and insert on department table to other users. This is mean by with the grant option. But in object privilege there is a cascading revoke. If you revoke update insert from tjohn user, there will be a cascading revoke of update and insert that tjohn user granted to other user. For example, if tjohn grant update and insert to user called user 2, if you revoke update and insert from tjohn, a cascading revoke of update and insert will happen also to user 2. This is the difference between with the grant option in object privilege and with admin option in system privilege. So in system privilege, there is no cascading revoke, while in object privilege, there is a cascading revoke. Using roles to manage privileges. Roles used to group together privileges and roles and to facilitate granting of multiple privileges or roles to users. For example, let's assume you have 100 database account user and all of these database account users must have the same privileges. Instead of going to each database user and grant them a specific privileges, you can create a role with a specific privileges. Create role, then assigning specific privileges like create table, create index, create view, create sequence to this role, and then assigning the role to a specific user. There are many built-in or predefined roles comes with the database. The most common predefined roles are connect, DBA, resource, scheduler underscore admin, and select underscore catalog underscore role. The first role, which is connect role has a create session privilege. So as we discussed before, if you create a database account, any database account created comes with no privileges, even he cannot connect to the database. So unable to allow the database user to connect to the database, you must grant either connect role or create session system privilege to the new created database account user. So the built-in or predefined connect role has only one system privilege, which is create session. The DBA role, this is a role comes with many system privileges and several other roles. So DBA is a super role. You have to be very careful of granting DBA role to a specific user because it comes with many system privileges and many other roles. Resource predefined roles. The resource predefined roles has create cluster, create index type, create operator, create a procedure, create sequence, create table, create trigger, and create type system privileges. Scheduler underscore admin predefined role comes with create any job, create external job, create any class, execute any program, and manage scheduler system privileges. The last one, which is select catalog role. This role comes with select privileges on data dictionary objects. So if you grant select catalog role to a specific database user, that database user can query the data dictionary like DBA underscore table, DBA underscore indexes, DBA underscore views, DBA underscore sequences, DBA underscore synonyms, and so on. So he can query the data dictionary tables and the views. How to create a role? Also, you can use Oracle Database Express or using Oracle SQL Plus to create a role. Creating a role is a straightforward, just providing a name for the role. You can use create role and specify the name of the role, or from SQL Plus go to security roles, create role, specify the name of the role, and click finish. Or you can go to next, assigning privilege to that role. For example, in our case, we created a manager underscore role with the create table and create view privilege. After creating the role, you can assign the role to a specific user. So that user will be able to create a table and create a view. After creating a role, you can assign the role to a specific user, like assigning privileges to a user. You can use either SQL Plus or you can use Oracle Database Express. To assign role to a specific database user, go to security, then select users. A list of all users will be displayed. Select the user that you want to change. From actions, select alter privileges and roles. Then select the role and move it by using this arrow sign. Then click OK. Or you can use SQL Plus to assign a role to a specific database user by using grant name of the role to then name of the database user account. Managing profiles. Profiles control resource consumption and manage account status and password expiration. So the profile control two things: resource consumption and account status and password expiration. In later slides, we will see how to create a profile and how to set resource consumption and account status and password expiration. You can assign a profile to a specific database user, or after creating a database user, you can assign a profile to a database user. If you don't specify a profile during database user account creation, the default profile is assigned to that user. Resource underscore limit database parameter must be set to true before profiles can impose resource limitation or resource consumption limitation. To create a profile, you can use Oracle Database Express, or you can use SQL Plus, or you can use also Oracle Cloud Control. To create a profile, go to Security, Profiles, and then create a profile. Specify name of the profile, for example, manager underscore profile. Click Next. Oracle will display you the resource consumption limitation. Again, the profile is used to control two things: resource consumption limitation and password and account status. So this screen, which is in the general screen, used to control resource consumption, and in the password screen, used to manage account status, expiration, and limitation. So in the general screen, this is used to control resource consumption limitation by the profile. The values specified for the resource consumption in the general tab will take effect only if the resource underscore limit database parameter is set to true, as we discussed before. If the resource underscore limit is set to false, any value specified here will not take any effect. But the resource underscore limit will not affect any value specified in the password section. Resource underscore limit will only affect the resource consumption limitation specified in the general tab. For example, you can specify CPU per session or CPU per call or connect time or ideal time. So here, as we can see, we specify 15 minutes for the ideal time. If the user connect to the database and doing nothing, just connect to the database and he didn't do anything for 15 minutes, the session will be terminated. This is mean by ideal time. We specified 120 minutes, which means 2 hours. If the user connect to the database for 2 hours, after 2 hours the session will be terminated. CPU per session, for example, 6000. This value should be divided by 100 in order to get number of seconds. In our case, 6000 over 100, which is equal to 60 seconds. So if your database account is assigned manager underscore profile, that means your session will use only 60 seconds from the CPU time. This is per call if you need to specify per call. Put unlimited, that means there is no limitation per call. If you specify default, that means this is the value is inherited from the default profile. If you specify unlimited, this means there is no limitation. Default means the value will be inherited from the default profile. For example, reads per session, how many blocks your session can read from the database files or from the SGA. Default means it will be inherited the value from the default profile. So this is the resource consumption limitation. Again, resource underscore limit parameter must be set to true in order for the resource consumption values to take effect. If the resource underscore limit is equal false, all values specified here will not take any effect. If you click next, account status and password expiration will be displayed. For example, expire in days 180 days. After 180 days, your password will be expired. After 5 days, if you don't change your password, the password will be locked. So this is the lifetime for your password. The lifetime for your password is 6 months in our case. After 6 months, your password will be expired. The password will be expired for 5 days. After 5 days, if you don't change your password, the password will be locked. Number of passwords to keep, or number of days to keep for. This is the password history. In our example, number of passwords to keep 4. So if your password currently is test, in order to use the same password test, you have to change the password 4 times. So this is the history. we use number of passwords. So the current password is test. Current password is test. This is the password history. So if you want to use the same password test again, you have to change the password 4 times. So this is, you change the password, for example, to test1, then you change it to test2, then you change it to test3, for example. So this is the history. Number of passwords to keep 4. So the history keep 4 passwords. So if you try now to change the password to use test, you cannot. You have to change it again to test4. So current password is test4. So the history is 4 passwords. So this is the history. This test password will be removed from history because the number of passwords to keep is 4 passwords. So now you can reuse test as a password, or you can use number of days to keep 4 instead of number of passwords. The password history will use number of days. For example, 2 days. Specify password history is 2 days. Specify 2 days as a password history. So the password history is 2 days. So if your current password is test, so if your password currently is test and you change it to test1, for example, test1, your password should be older than 2 days in order to reuse a test password again. Complexity function by default is null. If you want, for example, to specify restrictions for your password, for example, minimum 8 characters, your password should contain numbers and characters, there should be a special characters and so on, you can specify a complex function. Later on in this chapter we will see how to create a complex function to be used in the profile. Number of failed logins attempts to look for, number of days to look for. These two attributes used together. So after 6 failed attempts, your account will be locked for 1 day. This is mean by number of failed logins attempts to look after and number of days to look for. After 6 failed logins, your account will be locked for 1 day. If you want to specify, for example, hours, you can divide this value by, for example, 24. In this case, after 6 failed attempts, your account will be locked for 1 hour. If you want to specify by minutes, you can divide it by 24 multiplied by 60. Password verification function, as we discussed in the profile, here you can specify a complexity function. Complexity function is used to restrict the password. For example, minimum 8 characters, must contain numbers and characters, special characters, uppers and lower characters, and so on. This is mean by complexity functions. How to create a complexity function? You can create a normal function. If you are familiar with creating Oracle database function, you can create your own function, or you can run a script under Oracle Home RDBMS admin. This is the script. Util pwd mg stands for password management.sql. If you run this script, Oracle will create 3 verification functions: verify function 11g, Oracle 12c verify function, or a 12c strong verify function. You can use either one of these functions to specify a complexity function in the profile. Last thing in this chapter, which is assigning quotas to users. As we discussed in previous chapters, a table space is used to hold a segment comes from tables and indexes. So if you create a table or index, a segment will be allocated in the table space. So if you don't have a quota or unlimited table space system privilege, you cannot create a segment in the table space. So you must have either a specific quota or unlimited table space. So in this chapter we discussed how to create and manage database user accounts, how to grant and revoke privileges, how to create and manage roles, and last thing, how to create and manage profiles. In the practice, we will see how to create a profiles, how to create roles, and how to create a new database user accounts. I hope this video was informative for you, and thank you for watching.